Jordan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Great to get a chance to chat.
Let's start with MotherDuck, the fundamentals. So, for listeners who may not be familiar, can you explain what the company does?
Sure. So we build a data warehouse based on the open source DuckDB project. We're kind of founded on the idea that most people don't actually have big data, or at least if they do, they only process smaller amounts of it at a time. And so kind of a different architecture makes more for running your data. So it's a data warehouse similar to Snowflake, BigQuery, Redshift. We can do a lot of tasks that you need to analyze data, understand, ask questions of your data, ask questions of what's going on in my business. And we can be super lightweight. We can scale down. We can scale up to sort of some very large sizes. Yeah. So that's basically it.
Fantastic. And DuckDB obviously has gotten a whole bunch of traction when it's well known. So, I want to spend the next section just talking about shipping. So, a lot of our listeners, they're mostly they've built a couple of products they're shipping, but shipping with velocity and shipping quality product is always a challenge. I want to start with what principles do you use, or what guides your philosophy of shipping at MotherDuck? How do you think about it?
I think we try to take sort of a mix of top down and bottom up. Like there's certainly top down strategic objectives and things that, we have 3 to 5 kind of main things that we are driving towards kind of at all times. And everything that we're doing should snap to one of those. And they may not always be the same importance. Kind of we stack rank those. And that's sort of where a lot of the top down direction comes from. And then sort of the bottom up, it's like, hey, we have these things we'd like to do. If they fit into those kind of with the priority ranking, then we will green light. There's obviously some, keep the lights on, table stakes, things you just sort of have to do. And then the other one is that we try to set deadlines. And so when I was an engineer, I used to hate deadlines, and I used to be like, oh, well, why do we need deadlines? We should just, ship it when
Right.
it's ready. And the problem with that is like it leads you to sort of fiddle and sort of tweak, is like to get it perfect. And like sometimes actually having some deadline pressure is really useful at being like, okay, well, actually this part is not actually necessary. And you kind of, the part where you start to rip things out at the end is actually really useful, as well as to, it can be also helpful when you want to kind of align with the other groups in an organization. So it's not just an engineering driven organization. You have to communicate to customers. You have to be able to support what you're doing. You have to be able to sort of keep it up and running and have the right playbooks for SRE. Sometimes that feels like, well, it can feel like overhead when, from the engineering mindset of like, hey, this thing, I know how to do it. I know how to build it. I'm just going to get it out there. And then I think as the company grows, you sort of realize that if you surprise people in your company that you ship something, then, something was probably wrong. And that doesn't mean you can't move fast. You can't make quick decisions. Hey, for example, we had the opportunity to be one of the first companies in the Vercel, a native integration of the Vercel marketplace. That sort of meant that we had to make a bunch of move people around, prioritize this thing. But, the marketing team wanted to know that, hey, this is going to be available in Vercel. We needed to have documentation and end to end, and, how this works. What happens if somebody has an error, and how connecting all the billing, all sorts of billing questions can come up. And you can't make some of these decisions in a vacuum, at least after a certain point. When you get started, sure, fine. Just sort of, blast it out and get it done. Anyway, it's a long answer, but I think, tying to big strategic goals, and then setting big deadlines and using that to prioritize.
Right. That's amazing. Going to the early days, right? So when founding MotherDuck, Snowflake is a big company, many customers, and there are the Databricks. There are so many big companies doing something in data warehousing. So in the early days, how did you identify a need or an angle of attack, and what inspired the founding of MotherDuck? And also, perhaps, how did that translate to V1? Meaning, hey, these are the things we need to package and ship to get the early customers.
So kind of, I've been working on, data warehouses for data analytics for, I don't know, a dozen years. I worked in the early days of BigQuery and kind of stuck with that for a decade. I was in single store for a couple of years. And one of the things that I, had started to notice was just that, like, most people didn't have huge amounts of data. Like even at BigQuery, you think BigQuery, it's like giant data. And it's like, no, actually most people are using BigQuery because it's easy. It's just simple. It's, like pay as you go. Like you just fire off a query and it runs. And there was something really powerful about that. And it also seemed like everybody was out still chasing giant data. Like, the big data meme, was kind of still what people were focusing on. And, it really hit me when, there was this like benchmarking war between Snowflake and Databricks. And, Databricks said, hey, we have the fastest TPC DS benchmark result. And Snowflake said, no, we're faster. And then Databricks said, no, you're cheating. And like, it was just like, you sit on the sidelines and, eating popcorn. It's like, haha. But one of the things that I noticed was the data size that they were using was like 100 terabytes. And so 100 terabytes is like, so it's not just the total data set, but the queries that they're running are close to that size. And when I was in BigQuery, we had some of the largest customers in the world. We had Walmart, HSBC, Equifax, Home Depot, like, giant customers, and nobody was running queries at that size, literally nobody. And so it's like, wow, everybody else, like the big players are all focusing on trying to solve these hard problems at the scale that nobody has. That certainly that leaves kind of an opportunity to, like, because not all the problems are solved in the sort of the smaller scale, the use cases and the smaller scale of data. And it's like, okay, if you were really going to focus on those customers and the people that have kind of normal sized data, would you build things the same way? And would you have the same problems? And what could you do differently? And so I'm noticing that, for example, networks have gotten faster, laptops have gotten faster, servers have gotten bigger. So kind of the whole reason that people build these like scale out distributed systems like BigQuery, like Snowflake, like Redshift was because, the servers were small and you couldn't fit what you were doing on a single machine. And nowadays, like the Gravitron instances, on AWS are 192 cores, and I think half a terabyte of memory. Very, very, and this is a commodity machine. So there are very few workloads you can't fit in that amount of in that amount of hardware. And so kind of just spending all this energy kind of to split things up and to do these, build these distributed systems is sort of like, it slows you down by orders of magnitude. Like I remember in single store, like amazing engineering team. And so we built like this sort of distributed transaction stuff like that, like, which is really, really hard. It took probably an engineering decade to do, like, I did several people working on it and like lots of moving pieces. But like the reason you have to do that is because you have all these different machines and each one can fail and replication problems. And, what happens when this restarts, and like on a single node system, it's just so much easier and you can move faster. And I think at the end of the day, the people like that win, the companies that win and the technologies that win are the ones that can move fastest. And so I really thought, hey, there's an opportunity here to kind of build something differently, be able to move really fast. We recognized DuckDB kind of was, this academic, it was a couple of academics that created it. It seemed like, what at the time, like what differentiates it between, DuckDB and some random thing somebody created to, because they're, to write a paper. And one of the things that we noticed in a blog post about time zones. And in BigQuery, it took us like 5 years to actually do time zones because there's just so many really, really horrendous like details and problems and like, oh, everybody can use UTC, and like, but the fact that they had solved this so well, and had that attention to detail is like, no, this isn't just like something that somebody is writing to write a paper. This is a real system. And they do it right. And so we bet big on DuckDB. And I think that it has really paid off for us. You kind of mentioned what was the, or you asked what was the, what did the, V0, what was the requirement that we had to build? So we really wanted to have DuckDB running in the cloud, be able to fire off a query and have it just run. And like not have to worry about spinning up things, spinning down things. And, we also built this sort of hybrid execution system, which was a little bit harder than perhaps we needed it to be, but we also wanted to make sure that like we had a lot of intuition around, this is going to open up a lot of doors and open up a lot of kind of potential things and make a bunch of other things easier, but also made a bunch of things harder because you couldn't just like, fire off an API. The query that runs in the cloud is basically we take a query plan that runs locally, we split it into pieces, we run the pieces that need to run in the cloud, and then we kind of synchronize and like there's some hard stuff we had to build. It is paid off. It just sort of took a little bit longer than you otherwise would have expected.
What questions did you ask your early customers to validate the need? Because you're building a product for technical users, it's a database, and you're selling to people who are, as a developer, we scrutinize more, we're more picky in our products that we choose and buy. So for somebody out there building a product for technical users and developers, early stage founders, what can they ask? What questions can they ask to validate the need?
So I think there's actually two sides of the questions. There's sort of like, what did we ask and what can we ask? Some of the early founders and I, like we were really immersed in the business and in sort of the market. And, I'd been product manager for BigQuery and head of product and engineering for Single Store. And kind of really like had a lot of like comparative knowledge. This is what works. This is what people are asking for. Had talked to lots and lots of customers. So I think one of the things, the first thesis that we needed to validate was like, is this whole big data thing important? Like, do you have big data? Who's got big data? And so that was like, as we believe that if people don't have big data, something smaller would be, something that worked and was targeted at kind of the sizes data that people had, and could open up new opportunities for that data where was going to be useful. And I think we talked to a bunch of people, but it was less. I mean, I think there's a bunch of startups get created. You go around, you ask questions, and you kind of find pain points, and you kind of build something that will address those pain points. I think there's good things and bad things about that. The good thing is like if you find a hair on fire problem and you can solve that, people are going to be willing to just sort of say, please take my money, and they're willing to put up with a startup that has not doesn't have super polished technology. On the other hand, you're at the risk of like somebody else solving that problem or that problem going away. Sometimes that problem is in between two systems, and one of those systems just sort of moves to the left a little bit, and it that need goes away. And it's also kind of tends to be niche as opposed to like solving a broad category of problem. And so, what we're doing is we're solving sort of data warehousing problems. And it's sort of like, hey, people have a data warehouse. They understand what a data warehouse is. There's budget for a data warehouse. Like it's not a winner take all market. Like people use Snowflake, but not everybody uses Snowflake. And people use ClickHouse too. People use there's people are open to new technology if it works well and is different and is differentiated and can work better in their use cases. So I think it was a little bit differently than I think a lot of startups, when they get created. The other thing is, and in just terms of like asking people questions, and designing your roadmap or designing what you're building based on like the things you're asking users. It's often, to me, I find it's often like, as the product person, CEO, or the founder, and talking to customers or potential customers, you're more like a doctor than a therapist. Like you're like, you go to a doctor and you have a cough, like the doctor doesn't say, okay, I'll give you a, cough suppressant. Like they're like, hey, what's actually going on? You've got COVID, or you've got, strep throat, or you've got, they diagnose kind of what the underlying problem is rather than just sort of treating the symptoms. It's really tempting to just treat symptoms and be like, hey, you have this problem. Like, all right, you go and ask me to do this, and I'm going to go do this. And you ask me to do the next thing, and you go do that. And what the problem is, each customer asks things in a different way. First of all, they don't always know what they really want. They may ask you for you to build something in a certain way. If you go do that, that may not actually solve their problem, but also there's a good chance it won't solve the next person's problem. And so you kind of want to dig in and you understand what's actually going on, and then apply pattern matching, especially if you can sort of get down to like, these people have two different, very different problems. And when you can solve those two different problems with one thing, and that to me, that's the most exciting thing, when you realize that you're onto something. I think, an example in MotherDuck was, we had, some people having problems. Some of them were having problems with large, running larger queries. And some of them were having problems, doing certain kinds of data updates, larger, updating data. And really the problem was, so the thing that they were asking for was like, at bigger instances, or for the updates was like, hey, we need you to fix like the Parquet update. Really the problem was that DuckDB at the time wasn't great at out of core execution, which meaning sort of like, there's some things you can do which sort of all are in memory and they could blow up memory. And the changes were to fix how DuckDB worked, without out of core execution. So we worked with the DuckDB Labs team to kind of make sure that stuff all got in, and so that ended up solving those problems. But the kind of the two problems that people were asking for, necessarily the things that were related to even solving the problem. You kind of have to sort of dig in and diagnose.
When people are building like a net new product, there's a lot of information coming your way. Your own experience, your earlier companies, you talk to potential customers. Now you're talking to your users, your customers. So how do you decide what goes in, and more importantly, what features, like what needs to stay? Like what's the distraction? Because in the early stage, if you haven't done this before, you get overwhelmed and you're like, oh my God, I'm going to include all the features and hopefully something will stick. So more importantly, how do you decide what to leave out?
I think this is where setting a deadline can help. And so like in the early stages, we set a couple of deadlines. We were like, hey, for this board meeting, we want to have a demo for this, at this time, we're going to have, our first alpha or first, release where we're going to give it to customers. We want to hit beta at this point. And that just sort of helps you, because it's like, okay, I would love to add all of these things, but we can't. And it's like, and so you kind of have to have this sort of this moment where you're like, I know this is important and I would feel embarrassed to not have this in it, but it won't work at all if we don't have this other thing in it. So we kind of need this thing, and this has got to go in. And this other thing that we're going to be embarrassed about not having, well, it only you only need it in these small use cases, and we can have that be a fast follow. And so it's sort of a time-based prioritization. You stack rank things, work on the things you can. There's obviously a point before which you can be like, sometimes, you just, you can't ship something useful and without some of these other things. But sometimes you just sort of and that's helps you by setting deadlines. It's like, well, it should take us this long. In 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, we should have been able to solve this problem. And so we need to get something out. And it sort of it can give you kind of a kick in the pants to be like, well, we just gotta figure it out.
And when you are building a product, like databases, obviously they've been around for a long time and they'll continue to be around for a long time. Data warehouses, some managing data, that work is going to be there forever. So when you're building a product where it's a mature market, people know what it is, and you're presenting a net new thing. So how do you think about positioning this when you talk to a new customer? They don't know you, and frankly, there are too many people pitch them. So what advice do you have for people to position the thing they're building, which is new?
So it's a great question, because, you're going into a mature market with a new product, and your product is not going to have the same number of features. It's not going to be as reliable. It's not going to be, make as much sense as somebody else's. And so first of all, you have to have some sort of differentiation. You have to have some affirmative reason to choose the product that you're building versus what, the typical one is, because it's like people used to say, nobody gets fired for choosing IBM. These days it's like nobody gets fired for like choosing whatever is in the AWS, or, if there's a standard, you can sometimes, jump on the, cool tech bandwagon. I think there's a lot of tailwinds with DuckDB, and people were excited with DuckDB and sort of like, hey, we are the, kind of the DuckDB cloud database, and that, that got people to pay attention. The other thing is, the area of the market we went after was that we felt a different area of the market than other people like were typically, focusing on. Like when I was in Google Cloud, it was, enterprise, enterprise, enterprise. And the bigger the enterprise, the more we cared about it. And like Snowflake, clear that they're going after the giant customers that are going to spend, tens of millions of dollars or more on the product. And it's very hard to have a focus on that and be able to say, hey, hey, giant bank, you can give me $50 million a year. Like in order to win that customer, you have to develop a lot of energy to that customer. It's hard to do that. And at the same time, be like, hey, Joe mom and pop startup, I'm going to be really reactive to the things that you ask for. And so it's kind of going after the longer tail was a deliberate thing. It's not just because startups typically can do better at the long tail, but also because it allowed us to sort of get underneath where in the area where competitors weren't necessarily focusing on and weren't guaranteed to have the big the best product. Is like, if they're building something that's, designed to work really well in enterprise, it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to use. It doesn't or easy to set up or solve the problems of kind of the individual developer or the individual analyst, or the smaller use case. And so you can get in, you can start, and then you kind of work your way up. And there's sort of, from a strategy perspective, there's sort of like a counter positioning where, it's very hard for them to be good at what they're doing as well as be good at what you're doing. And so you can basically kind of start to grow and come in underneath, particularly from like a pricing perspective. Hey, if we can be less expensive, there's a lot of people frustrated about pricing. But so that's one area of differentiation. Like you can't just be less expensive. And you can't just be faster. Like, I think there's the trap that I see people falling into, which is, hey, we're going to be fast. Like, and the problem about that is your self-worth is defined in a relative value. And so somebody else can come along and be faster. And now you're like, well, I guess we have to figure out what what actually we're going to be. It's a little bit like high frequency trading. You see like high frequency trading. If you do it well, you basically can print money if you're the fastest. But if you're the second fastest, you go out of business. And so, and so I think it's a dangerous, kind of trap to fall into. And you see a lot of people be like, hey, that we're going to be the fastest at X. Because the other thing is like fast is always such even for something as simple as databases, like, does it mean, the lowest latency, good at joins, good at like, dealing with low memory conditions, good at complex queries, good at like, there's just all sorts of good at lookups, good at mutations, or being able to, use, Parquet files on S3. Like there's all sorts of like variations and for performance, and nobody's going to be fastest at all of them because, whatever architecture you choose is going to optimize for certain types of workloads against other ones. Anyway, sorry, that was a little bit of a rant, but there's something you often see. So you have to pick differentiation. You have to come up with something that's your own. And there's also, there's some pitfalls that you can get into.
I think that's a great point, because if being fast is your thing, you found a way to be fast. Pretty sure somebody else is going to find a way to be a teeny bit faster. So the thing that you're hanging your hat on, it's not going to exist anymore. So I think it's a very good point that you have to find out why you are 10x different along one dimension. There are so many dimensions, just pick one and be 10x different. Nobody should be able to even be anywhere close to you. So I think that's a great point. Looking back to all these years, MotherDuck, now it's a bigger company, customers, revenue, funding. What's been the biggest or most significant challenge in building MotherDuck to this stage?
So I don't know how well this generalizes, but I think we did things in a different order than everybody else typically does things. And you know, we were incredibly fortunate to be in the right time, the right place with kind of the right team. There was tailwinds with DuckDB. There was kind of excitement around, Snowflake had, been the biggest IPO in history, and people are like, hey, they wanted to jump on the data bandwagon. And kind of I had been the most visible person at the closest competitor to Snowflake. And so we raised a lot of money right out of the gate. We had, DuckDB was also kind of ascendant at that time. And so, we were able to grow the team pretty quickly. So, things that are hard for, in a lot of startups, which is like, okay, you got to build the initial V1 and, on scraps, and then you can hopefully raise, and then you can build a couple, have a couple more people, so we did things in different order. And the thing is, when you do those in the traditional order, you kind of start to build up, there's muscles you start building up that, can be dangerous in a company where you don't go through that sort of crucible to get to funding. Like, we had, 2 years before we had any revenue. We had a product out, we had a bunch of users, we had kind of a bunch of excitement. People knew DuckDB, but we were fortunate that we didn't have to have revenue. And so kind of just the hard part has been sort of like going back and making sure that we, first of all, like, we don't take anything for granted. That's been incredibly important to me, is that you can't feel like, hey, we're flying high. We're better than anybody. Like, that's an incredibly dangerous, place to feel. It never feel like, hey, we have lots of money in the bank, or never feel like comfortable with the amount of money in the bank. Never feel like, hey, well, whatever, we can just hire some more people, maintaining sort of a mentality of scarcity, but then also making sure that, okay, now we're selling, we haven't done this before, we have to get good at this really quickly. And we don't have some of the feedback mechanisms that, we could have had earlier, had we started doing those in early days. So I would say that's sort of the trickiest part, and it means that, like, one of our VCs said, in a lot of ways, you guys, you guys are Series B company, successful, you raise a lot of money, but in other ways, you're closer to like a pre-seed company, and they weren't wrong. And kind of, we needed to sort of not be like, it's easy to, when somebody says that, to be like, oh, what do you mean? Like, that's bullshit. Sorry, I'm allowed to say that on podcast. But then you're like, well, no, actually, they have a point. Like, what do I need to learn? What do I need to do so I don't look like the pre-seed company? And where do we have to get? And so, that's been a challenge, but it's been fun. I think we're plotting our own path, and we're not trying to like basically say we're going to be just like anybody else.
One of the biggest challenges that early stage founders, first time founders, they face is when you ship a new feature, it's like they ship it into vacuum because they just don't know what happened. Because if it's a simple example that it's an e-commerce site, you make a change, the conversion rate doubles, great, it works. Or you're a consumer app and you make a change and the average session time increases by 42%. Great, that's the thing you wanted to do, you did it, and it worked. In enterprise, especially when you're selling a product to technical users or big customers, how do you measure the success of a new feature that gets shipped? Because you need that data to rally the team to do the next big thing. Because if you're like, oh, great, thank you for shipping, I don't know what happened, it's just not very motivating. So how do you think about measuring the success of every new feature that you ship?
So I think a couple of different ways. I think one is, it's one of the reasons that we haven't gone after big enterprises, because I've seen in the past, like, when you do go after big enterprises, you can get into this, somebody says, hey, we will, they hold $1 million check in front of you and be like, we will give you this $1 million check if you could build X, Y, and Z. And so you go on off and you build X, Y, and Z. And then, the next customer holds $1 million check, and you go do that. And you kind of feel like, okay, well, the stuff that we're doing is the stuff that we would have done anyway, just maybe in a different order. But very often that's not the case. and you can get into a spot where you're not actually really finding product market fit. You are finding, I think finding product market fit at Goldman Sachs or at, Bank of America or at some big enterprise or big company. And that, that may not actually apply to anybody else. And so by going after the long tail, we're going after lots of users, lots of adoption, and you can sort of see in a bit more real time, because not long sales cycles, you kind of get to see, how's the adoption going. So you can reduce the feedback loop time. On the other hand, you don't have these hey, these three things, the deal blocker, you build those, I'll give you the check. This sort of like this big pot of gold at the end of they can validate those features. The other way I think about building features, and especially for infrastructure projects, is it's a little bit like chess. Like somebody once talked about the beginning stages of chess, as you're not really going after it, and you're, attacking and trying to sort of win or take pieces on every move. You're basically trying to establish a position on the board, and that has it's a position of strength. And moves that you take, yes, they may get you closer to where you want to be, but they're also going to start to interlock together. And I think a lot of the features that you do, will end up interlocking. And, if I can give an example of we did Vercel marketplace integration. I mentioned that earlier. And it's okay, so that's one thing. We get a certain number of signups from Vercel. That, we could measure that as hey, 100 signups a week would be our goal. But on the other hand, there's also, okay, so this opens up an aperture of new users, new use cases. There's another feature we're working on, which is PG DuckDB, which is sort of like this DuckDB Postgres extension that can then talk to MotherDuck. So if you take that, you take also, okay, well, also on Vercel, there are these hosted Postgres providers. If we can get them to run PG DuckDB, then that's sort of another, okay, this is a great option. But you tie that together with the Vercel, and now all of a sudden you kind of have these new things that, okay, somebody's already in Vercel, they have Postgres, now they can use MotherDuck. That multiplies the impact. And so I think a lot of features, should not necessarily be taken in isolation, but they can, they need to be taken in sort of how do they open the aperture? How do they combine with the other things that you're building to kind of get to the point that you want to be, even if that feature may not move the needle on it.
And to build a company that can build and sell with velocity, you need a good org structure. So how have you structured your company? And also, more importantly, what was the thought process behind structuring the company in a specific way?
So we started with a super senior engineering team. We had, 3 or 4 people who, would have been, considered kind of director level at Google, or, Snowflake, Facebook, et cetera. But they were ICs. And so, whereas you might have, if we just have one of those, that's one of them would have been sort of the obvious choice for a CTO, but we had 3 of them. And so that made it a little bit weird, because then if you were to hire a head of engineering, do the people report to the head of engineering? And so that was tricky from the start. And we basically had each one of those as technical leads of different areas. And, we kind of grew that way. And then we eventually hired a head of engineering, somebody that I'd worked with before, and who was also kind of similarly very, very senior, but also kind of, knew how to build organizations. And sort of the deep technical was not as important, although this person did have a, PhD at compiler. So is very, very deeply technical, but also wasn't going to be hey, this is the architecture we need to build. This wasn't the reason to hire. That wasn't because they were going to drive the kind of the technical direction. We had plenty of people who would do that. Then obviously you need other, you tend to start with engineering. Then you need other pieces, product. We started with a DevRel, somebody who had DevRel experience, head of DevRel at Databricks. So kind of very awesome DevRel. And because we were doing really and had that person be our lead marketing, because developer marketing, when you're selling to a technical audience, you kind of, they don't like to be marketed to. And so starting with somebody who really knows how to connect with developers was important. And, they've kind of turned into a great marketer as well. The other, customer success was another area where I had seen at Looker, this customer success organization they built, which was extraordinary, called the Department of Customer Love, which is like one of the reasons that people liked Lookers, because their support was so great. Like they made their customers feel like Looker had just sort of wrapped their arms around them and just sort of give them a big, made like, we're going to make you successful. And so we hired the person who created that to lead our customer success department, which we call the hatchery. Or helping our customers learn to fly with our technology, incubating them and all that stuff. And had to build a sales team, and building a sales team is tricky. But anyway, so like I have 4 different meetings. So one is like, call it corp. The goal was to call it something boring, so people wouldn't be like, well, why am I not in corp? It's like, hey, we're solving all the boring problems, so you don't have to think about them. And those are essentially my directs, the head of departments. We have Eng strategy, which is sort of these sort of super senior engineering leaders and head of product and head of engineering, and kind of like, what are we building? Why are we building it? And they're, bounce ideas off, like, and, I expect my ideas to get shot down but just try to hone what we're building and the order that we're building it. There's go-to-market strategy, which is, we ever go to, like sales, marketing, head of growth, et cetera. That's just sort of how are we selling? How are we going to market? And then back office, which is sort of like operations, facilities, like, how are we, what's the, benefits and, things like that, and kind of dealing with people issues. And I think that works pretty well, because, corp can tie it all together, and then kind of the different areas are all separate.
Perfect. That's wonderful. And I have one final question before we go to the rapid fire round. How are you preparing MotherDuck for this AI native era they're entering? Are you changing anything, or perhaps you're already structured to address all the needs of your customers? How are you thinking about that?
So, we kind of have a multifaceted approach. One is, obviously, how do we use it? How do we use AI to do what we're doing better? And so that means, co-pilots and stuff like that. But it also means like, I think there's opportunities to use AI to help improve the support process, help the documentation process. Not necessarily customer-facing AI things, which can be annoying, but sort of like things that could, kind of give superpowers to our support folks to be able to like find things that they find and answer questions that they need really quickly. Then there's the stuff that's going into the product, and like being able to give our customers superpowers on, and data, and being able to ask things in English, and, text to SQL is notoriously bad, but, there are actually some constrained cases where it can work well. So we kind of have put some things in the product, our own co-pilots, and, the ability to author their SQL code and autocomplete and automatically fixing errors as well as like, giving you the ability to generate embeddings automatically, and, run a AI prompt over all the data in your database or in your query. So, a bunch of those things. And then solutions is making sure that we kind of like educate people on how to use this, because AI is like, a lot of things you can do with AI are, relatively nascent, and people are just starting to figure some of these things out. And if we can help provide documentation and examples, that can be also a way to get people to use it. And then partnerships, making sure that we partner and, have the connections and the connectors with, LangChain and OpenAI and, other technologies that people are using, to build applications.
Fantastic. With that, we are at the rapid fire round. I'll ask a series of questions and would love to hear your answers in 15 seconds or less. You ready?
Sure.
All right. Question number 1. What's your favorite book?
I would say Master and Margarita. And just my second date with my wife, we went to a bookstore and we each bought each other a book. That was the book I bought her. She bought me Our Man in Havana by Graham Greene, and now she's an independent bookseller.
I love that book. It was amazing, and that made me look into Pontius Pilate. Like it went out of a history tour, because like this is anyway. that's a whole separate conversation. Huge fan of the book, and anyway, thank you for saying it because it rarely gets mentioned. So I appreciate that. Next question: what has been an important but overlooked technology trend in the last 12?
Important but overlooked. I think most of the times where they're, if they're a trend, they're not over. They say that, that laptops keep getting faster and faster and more powerful. And I think that hasn't really changed how people are doing things yet. But I think that's, we're going to start seeing some interesting things there.
What's the one thing about data warehouses that most people don't get?
Most people don't get the importance of metadata. You hear a lot of the talk about like the separation of storage and compute and these separate iceberg, open storage systems versus like compute. The part in the middle that gets nasty is metadata, and people are starting to figure that out with like, hey, well, what about the catalog? But that whole area is a mess, and just because actually that's where a lot of the hardest things go on, and it's just something that people don't necessarily realize.
What separates great products from the merely good ones?
I think it's the ability to basically take things away that people expect. It's like the iPhone is the canonical example where like, people thought you needed a keyboard and they took it away, and they realized that because if you take this away, we can then give you all these other things. Or, Tesla, whatever you feel about Tesla, like they did some amazing things where they basically take all the buttons and stuff away. Everything's just a screen. And like, I think, and it really can work.
That's fantastic. All right, next question. What have you changed your mind on recently?
I think Iceberg, actually, I was not a proponent of that. I was like, it's like the problem it was solving seemed like not trivially solved by data warehouses, but I also kind of have recognized that like, hey, this is here and it's something, and a lot of people are excited about it. So kind of you need to have a good story around it.
What's your wildest prediction for the next 12?
This may not be an exciting one, but it's like maybe I feel like the data market is solidifying. And I think that unless there's something, AI magic, there are going to be no great data companies started in the next 12 months.
All right, final question. What's your number one advice to founders who are starting up today?
I see a lot of people who kind of are putting like Legos together and like, hey, we could put these two things together and build a startup. And that's really hard. And I think the most interesting startups are ones that you go against the conventional wisdom. So I would almost say take something obvious and then do the opposite, and like, or at least validate the opposite. Like, everybody says this is what's happening. Startups are sort of default fail. It's like, they're expected to fail, but it's like, okay, if the conventional wisdom doesn't turn out, where would it end up? And because the conventional wisdom very often doesn't turn out the way people expect. And so kind of, if you can have the thing that is different and you can have conviction around that, then I think you can build something pretty interesting.
Brilliant. Jordan, this has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, wisdom, and just like hard-earned knowledge on what it takes to ship products. So thanks again for coming onto the show.
Thanks. I enjoyed it.